Well, how are you doing? I haven't been able to tell you the next story for 2 or 3 days here because it's been raining. And there's always the possibility that sometime when we're visiting and telling stories like this, all of a sudden you'll be able to hear thunder and rain. Right above my head is a tin roof, metal roof. Hanna and I live in this little funny tin building out here in the countryside. And when the rain falls, it gets very noisy in here. So we've been waiting for the rain to go away, and finally, now it's quiet. So I'm so glad to see you again. And I have a story about life out in the forest. There was this very nice couple. They had a beautiful daughter whose name was Mary. And she had one friend, a little boy named Martin. Martin lived just down the road. And they would play every day, and they made up wonderful games. And the only thing that Mary's father worried about was there was kind of a dark grove of trees. They were fir trees, sort of like Christmas trees, and they grew all close together. And it was always misty in there and kind of hard to see and thick, and there weren't any real paths. And there was always a sense that something lived in there, but you were never sure what. Like you could hear things, and once in a while in the evening you thought you saw something, but you were never sure. So he worried about that grove of trees. Now, other than that, they could play any place, and he didn't worry. But Mary's mother thought it was such a lovely place they lived, and nice green meadows and blue sky and white clouds and nice animals, and everything seemed to be very nice. She thought it was probably pretty safe everywhere. Well, one day, Mary and Martin are playing hide and seek, and it's his turn to hide. And she looks everywhere, and she can't find him. And she finally decides he's got to be somewhere in that grove. It just must be. She looked every place else. So she went over and she started to see if she could find a little path, and all of a sudden she sees this little puppy dog running kind of towards her from right in the middle of this thicket, and bouncing around and wagging his tail, and his whole back end was dancing back and forth. He was wagging his tail so hard, and he looked just so thrilled to see her, but he kept turning around and running back like he wanted her to follow him. So she decided, of course, that's where Martin is. And she ran after the puppy dog, and there was this kind of path she'd never discovered, and they're running down the path, and all of a sudden, she discovers she's in this meadow, and it's beautiful beyond description. It's so green, and the sky is so blue, and there's marvelous birds singing everywhere, and little animals running around playing with one another. And all of a sudden, she sees a bunch of little children. And she's just delighted. I mean, there hasn't ever been any other little children except Martin to play with. And she starts to run over there. And as she gets close, she realizes it isn't that they were as far away as she thought. They're little. But they're magic. They can fly around, and they just have these gorgeous dresses and little suits on. They seem to pretty much be all girls, actually. And one of them comes over to Mary and says in this clear, lovely voice, "Aldo, I'm so glad you finally come to play with us. We've often come over and watched you and that little boy play over by your house, and I've always hoped that someday you would come over and play with us. My name is Gossamer, and let me show you some of the games we play." And she just came up and took Mary's hand, and they had the most marvelous games. Now, they could do things Mary had never seen anybody do. They could take seeds and throw them in the ground and then run over and get where the seeds were, and trees would just grow, and they'd go right up in the air with these, be in the top of these magic trees. And all of these little girls were small, but they were very strong. And all of a sudden, Mary realized they could just take her, and she could fly like they could, from branch to branch. And the animals would leap higher than she'd ever seen, little bunny rabbits and so on, leaping around. It was magic, and it was wonderful. And they took her over to this castle, and Gossamer explained the reason Mary could come in and play this day is that the queen was gone. She was in another fairy kingdom. And Gossamer explained that they were called elves. Now, you've heard of elves. It's elves that make all of the toys that Santa Claus takes around every Christmas. And elves have learned that humans, particularly adults, you have to stay away from them, because adults try to capture elves. Men particularly do this and put them in little cages and make money from them, or make the little elves work for them. And so the elves won't let any of the adults come near them and get anywhere near their queen. So they have little sentries all around this grove of trees watching, and a great warning system. But in this castle, it's just magic, and there are these tables of food every place, and there's all kinds of beautiful jewels and wonderful things. Gossamer went over and she picked up this lovely ring, gave it to Mary. Mary could wear it. I've shown you this ring before. This was like Mary's ring. This was my mother's ring. And so Gossamer explained that soon the queen would come back, and they would have to stop playing. And it was getting dark, and they were all getting just a little bit tired. And so they didn't want Mary's mother and father to get worried that anything bad had happened to her. And Gossamer made Mary promise. She said, "Now you keep the ring so you can always remember what a wonderful day we've had. And I'll come over and watch you play. And if the queen ever goes away on another visit, why, we'll have another day we can spend together. But don't you ever forget your wonderful friends here. We love you." And so she, and Mary was suddenly right back near her house. So she started to rush in to make sure her parents weren't worried, and she noticed that it looked kind of strange around her house, but she couldn't figure out what was different. And she went in, and the first thing she saw was her father, and he was much older. And her mother came out of the kitchen, and she was much older. And there was a man there she didn't even know. And she said, "Father, something's changed here. I can't imagine what it is. I've had a wonderful day, but I was afraid you might think I got lost. I'm sorry I was a little late getting back this afternoon." And he came up very close, and he looked at her, and then he put his arms around her, and he started to weep, and her mother came rushing over. And the father said, "Mary, I don't know, this is the most wonderful day of my life. You disappeared 7 years ago, and we thought you were dead. And we just searched everywhere for you. I'm so thrilled. You've made me happier than I've ever been that you've come back, and you look wonderful." Well, Mary went over and looked in the mirror and was astounded. I mean, she was 10 years old when she went out to play to her today, and here's this young woman looking back at her from the mirror. And she realizes then that young man is Martin, and he can't take his eyes off of her, and she likes the way he's grown up. Well, time passed, and she never, of course, told her parents or Martin exactly what happened. She remembered her promise, and she made up a little story that some magic gypsies had kind of found her, and they took care of her, and then one day she was able to kind of get away when they came back in this neighborhood and come back to her home. But she'd had a fine life, and everybody treated her very well. And they believed that. And it almost came to be like, well, this maybe was just a dream, but she always had this ring, and she always wore it. But she and Martin fell in love and got married and built a little cottage right near her parents' cottage. And pretty quick, they had a beautiful baby girl. Just perfect little baby girl. And when she got to be about your age, all of a sudden, one late afternoon, she came running in from playing, and Mary saw there was something she was wearing around her throat. And Mary looked, and it was a beautiful, beautiful pendant on a gold thread. And Mary went over to look at it, and the little girl, whose name was Elfie, the parents had named this the Elfin Grove, and after the elves, Mary and Martin had named their daughter Elfie. And Elfie was a little upset that Mary had seen this. She had forgotten she was wearing it. And she said, "Oh, I found it on the ground." But Mary knew that could only have come from Gossamer. Gossamer had been wearing one of those, and Mary had never forgotten it. So she knew that Gossamer had been watching, and so Mary waited, and the next afternoon when Elfie went out to play, Mary followed at a distance, and she saw Elfie go over in this little corner by this grove of fir trees, and here came Gossamer. And the two of them had the most wonderful afternoon. And Mary realized, well, the Queen's home, and so Elfie can't go in as she could, but Gossamer could come out and play. And they just had this great time. So every afternoon, Mary would follow and just watch, and she was delighted And once in a while she'd get close and she could hear Gossamer talking about how marvelous it had been when Mary had come and they had played and had all these games, and she was teaching some of those games to Elfie. And all of a sudden one day, Mary saw Gossamer just take Elfie's hand and fly right up in the air just towards a branch of one of these trees. And Mary was just startled, and before she caught herself, she gasped out loud, and they heard her. And instantly, Elfie was right back at her feet and Gossamer was gone. Well, Mary was just really worried that Gossamer would never come back. But every afternoon, Elfie would go out and play, and Mary would stay at a distance. And finally, Gossamer came back, and they started to play again. And one day, Gossamer brought some flowers with her. Very, very pretty, very special flowers. And gave them to Elfie and said, now you take these home and put them in your room and water them and take care of them. And someday they'll be very important and they'll always remind you of me. So this was just going on, and the whole summer was the most magic time. Unfortunately, one evening after Elfie'd gone to sleep, Mary's sitting and sewing and talking to Martin, and she mentioned something about the magic elf, and Elfie did something that afternoon. Words just slipped out, and Martin wanted to know what she was talking about. Well, she loved Martin and she trusted him, so she told him a little bit. But she said, now you mustn't go anywhere near this fir grove. You must never try to find Gossamer, because if you do, the elves will know that there's a threat to the queen and they'll have to move away. But just believe me, our daughter has a wonderful friend. Well, of course, he just couldn't stand it, you know, how some men are. And so he snuck over the next afternoon, and he's hidden. And pretty quick, Elfie comes out, and all of a sudden he sees this beautiful little magic girl. And they're running and having this marvelous time, and all of a sudden Gossamer takes Elfie by the hand, and they just start to fly up to a branch, and Martin runs out. He's terrified that Elfie's going to fall. And they see him. And instantly, of course, Elfie is right back at his feet. And Gossamer is gone. And Mary comes out of her hiding place, and she and Elfie are very, very sad. They know that Martin has threatened the queen. And, you know, he didn't know, and he started running around and making a bunch of noise. And so that very night, there were all of these sounds coming out of this grove of fir trees, these Christmas trees. And they could, they thought they could see movement and they could hear things. And the next morning, there was a man and his wife. There was a big lake not far away. And there was a pile of those coins, you know, in his boat. He had a big ferry boat. He would row people across the lake. And it looked like somebody had, all night, they had used his boat, and then they had left some coins for using the boat. But nobody ever really saw this. But everything changed there in the village a little. It just wasn't ever as green again, or the sky as blue, or quite as many pretty birds or animals. But Elfie always had her beautiful magic pendant, and Mary always had her magic sparkling ring, and they planted those flowers. And this flower tree grew, and it was just huge. And it seemed like almost every time you looked at it, the flowers were a different color. And Mary and Elfie would sit under that tree all the years that Elfie was growing up. And Mary would tell her the whole story of everything that happened on what to her was the day, but was 7 years that she spent with the magic elves. And gradually, Elfie learned that story just as you're learning it tonight. Well, that's a lovely story. Make me a little picture of something you remember tomorrow. And you learn that story, and you can tell it to your little children many, many, many years from now. And they'll tell it to their children. And that's what stories are for. Well, I'm tired, and I'm so glad that we got this story finished before it started to rain again. And I know a story that I'm going to tell you tomorrow about a little boy and a girl. And I think you're going to like it. You have a wonderful night. Love you. See you tomorrow.